Imagine a new front exploding in Europe's bloodiest war. A longtime ally of the Kremlin opens its arsenals and borders to full combat. The world holds its breath. This is the nightmare scenario of Belarus joining Russia's war against Ukraine, a move that could unleash catastrophic consequences on multiple fronts. Belarus's dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, has so far stopped short of sending his own army into the fight, even as he let Russia use Belarusian soil to invade Ukraine in 2022. Russian troops, about 30,000 of them, poured over the Belarus-Ukraine border in a failed blitz toward Kyiv, and Russian missiles have roared off Belarusian launch pads toward Ukrainian cities. In effect, Belarus has already been an accomplice to Putin's invasion, short of direct troop engagement. Now, under increasing pressure from Moscow, what if Lukashenko's regime actually commits Belarusian forces to battle? The stakes would skyrocket, and the fallout would be devastating, not only for Ukraine, but for Belarus itself and the wider world. In this video, we'll explore the dire military, geopolitical, economic, and domestic repercussions if Belarus joins the war, and why the gravity of this decision cannot be overstated. Lukashenko has long boasted about keeping Belarus out of direct war, claiming he'd never let conflict engulf his country. But as Russia's campaign struggles and Putin looks for any advantage, Belarus faces intense Kremlin pressure to jump into the fight. Ukraine's government has bluntly warned Minsk of tragic consequences if the Belarusian military joins the invasion. Those consequences would reach far beyond the battlefield, from potential military escalation to economic ruin, international backlash, and even the possible collapse of Lukashenko's own regime. Let's break down each of these perilous dimensions. If Belarus openly joins the war, the battlefield immediately expands. Ukrainian officials have made it clear that the moment Belarusian troops cross the border, all troop concentrations, military facilities, and supply routes in Belarus will become legitimate targets for Ukraine's army. In other words, Belarus would instantly become a combat zone. We could expect Ukrainian missiles and drones striking bases around Minsk, Brest, and other Belarusian cities where Russian or Belarusian forces mass, a dramatic widening of the conflict. A Belarusian entry might begin with an attack from the north, similar to the 2022 Kyiv offensive, or even further west. Ukrainian commanders warn that Russia could use Belarus to launch a new thrust from the west of Belarus to cut off the main supply routes for foreign arms and equipment coming into Ukraine from Poland. On screen, an animation traces a possible attack vector from Belarus toward western Ukraine's supply corridor. The aim of such a move would be to sever the lifeline of Western military aid flowing through Poland into Ukraine. A bold and perilous gambit. Militarily, how much could Belarus actually change the situation? The reality is that Belarus's armed forces are far smaller and less battle-tested than Russia's, and we've seen how Russia has struggled. On paper, Belarus has around 60 to 70,000 active duty personnel, but most are conscripts and support staff. The real combat-ready force might be as low as 45,000 troops. Since the war began, Lukashenko's generals have scrambled to stand up a new southern command on the Ukrainian border, deploying brigade groups that should have 4,500 soldiers each. Yet in practice, they're only at about 50% strength. Many units are understaffed and under-equipped. In a sign of desperation, the regime even formed a new People's Militia of regime loyalists to plug gaps and prevent desertions en masse if war breaks out. That's right, they expect their soldiers might refuse to fight and have created militia units to literally stand behind the regular army and keep them in line. This hints at a serious morale problem. Indeed, morale in Belarus's military is low. In the first weeks of Russia's invasion, Belarus's own deputy defense minister reportedly resigned, saying his soldiers do not want to take part in this war. Intelligence reports indicate a great deal of demoralization among Belarusian conscripts. They simply have no desire to die in Ukraine. Lukashenko is painfully aware that ordering his army to attack could lead to mass refusal or collapse of units. Belarusian troops have never experienced a modern high-intensity war. Facing Ukraine's seasoned fighters armed with Western weapons, they would likely suffer devastating losses. We could witness tragic scenes of young Belarusian conscripts who a week prior were drilling on a parade ground, suddenly thrown into the meat grinder of the Ukrainian front, with dire results for them and no meaningful gains for Russia. Such an outcome would not only be a humanitarian catastrophe for Belarus, but it could shatter the myth of Lukashenko's military might. Additionally, the moment Belarus enters combat, Ukraine is likely to strike back at targets inside Belarus. We're not only talking about military clashes at the border. We mean Ukrainian missiles hitting air bases near Minsk or command centers in Gomel. Remember, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs warned that if Belarusian forces join the invasion, all troop concentrations, military facilities, and supply routes in Belarus will become legitimate targets. That could mean air raids on bases where joint Russian-Belarusian units gather, or special forces operations deep in Belarus to sabotage rail lines and depots. In effect, Belarus would become an active war zone, possibly for the first time since World War II. For the Belarusian people, who have lived in relative peace for decades under Lukashenko's rule despite political repression, this would mark the end of any illusion of safety. Towns and cities that have never seen a missile strike in modern memory might suddenly hear air raid sirens. This is the immediate military peril of Belarus joining the war. The conflict would engulf an entirely new country, raising the risk of a broader regional war. Beyond the battlefield, a Belarusian entry into the war would jolt the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe. NATO would treat Belarus as a direct threat. Already, Belarus's involvement as a staging area for Russia has significantly raised tensions with NATO allies to the west, including Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Those countries have been strengthening their defenses for over a year. Poland, for instance, deployed more troops to its border and hastily built border fences after Belarus enabled Russia's invasion. If Belarus officially joins the fighting, Poland and the Baltic states would likely invoke urgent consultations and further beef up their militaries on the frontier. We could see NATO battle groups in Poland and Lithuania put on high alert, Patriot anti-missile batteries scanning the skies near Belarus, and contingency plans activated for worst-case scenarios. The possibility of miscalculation rises. With opposing forces in such proximity, even a small incident, say a stray missile crossing into Polish territory, could spark a wider confrontation. It's a scenario that diplomats have feared since 2022. The war could spill over Ukraine's borders, directly drawing NATO into the conflict. Diplomatic isolation of Belarus would also intensify. Western nations would condemn Minsk in the strongest terms, likely declaring Belarus an active co-belligerent. Already, NATO allies have officially condemned Belarus for enabling Russia's full-scale invasion and its ongoing complicity in Russia's war of aggression. If Belarus sends troops, it would be seen as an outright act of aggression against Ukraine, potentially triggering a new round of United Nations resolutions and even more severe international sanctions. Belarus would complete its transformation into a pariah state alongside Russia. Any remaining ambassadors from EU countries would likely be withdrawn from Minsk in protest. The message from the West would be clear. Lukashenko's regime has made itself an enemy of European peace. Recently, Putin announced the deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarusian territory, something 74% of Belarusians oppose. With nukes stationed in Belarus, any conflict involving that territory raises chilling questions. Would Putin consider moving or using these weapons if the tide turns? Does Belarus become a nuclear target for NATO planning purposes? Opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya has warned that hosting Russian nukes will make Belarus a potential target in the East-West confrontation. If Belarus enters the war, this nightmare comes closer to reality. NATO would be forced to reckon with nuclear-capable forces operating from Belarus, a scenario reminiscent of Cold War showdowns. The mere presence of these warheads on Belarusian soil could escalate any crisis of miscommunication into a nuclear standoff. In essence, Belarus's involvement would heighten the nuclear tension of the war, a truly catastrophic prospect for the whole world. Belarus was already facing economic pain from sanctions and isolation, but joining the war would cripple its economy outright. Since 2020, and especially after helping Russia's 2022 invasion, Belarus has been hit with wave after wave of Western sanctions. These measures have targeted everything from Belarusian banks and oil products to its lucrative potash fertilizer industry. The results have been severe. The country went into a recession with GDP shrinking by 4.7% in 2022, and its fragile economy has been kept afloat only by Russian support. Moscow has effectively propped up Minsk with cheap energy and loans, over $15 billion in subsidies in 2022 alone. As analysts note, if Lukashenko throws Belarus into the war, the West would respond with even harsher sanctions, possibly a full financial blockade akin to what Russia faces. Belarus could be completely cut off from the global banking system. Its export markets would evaporate, and foreign investors would flee entirely. The economic shock could be catastrophic. Belarus's lifeline is Russia, and even that has limits. With Western trade cut off, Belarus has had to rely on Russia's ports and markets to sell its goods. If it fully joins the war, neighboring countries would likely close their borders entirely. Imagine freight trains halted at the border, trucks backed up for miles, and Belarus's key exports, potash, timber, machinery, stranded. Even China's Belt and Road shipments that pass through Belarus could be disrupted if the security situation deteriorates. Belarus would essentially face an economic blockade from the West. Its only remaining trade would be with Russia, which is itself heavily sanctioned and struggling. For an economy of Belarus's size, losing its main markets would be devastating. Factories would shut down due to lack of parts or buyers, unemployment would spike, and with war mobilization, many workers would be conscripted or diverted to the military. It's a recipe for an economic meltdown reminiscent of the post-Soviet collapse, if not worse. Perhaps the most volatile consequence for Lukashenko, if he joins the war, is internal backlash. The Belarusian people have not forgotten their nation's history as a battleground in others' wars. They have no appetite to become cannon fodder for Putin's ambitions. Polls indicate that a staggering 80% of Belarusians oppose sending their army to fight in Ukraine. By dragging Belarus into the conflict, Lukashenko would be going directly against the overwhelming sentiment of his own population. A risky move for any dictator, no matter how brutal his security forces. Despite a climate of fear, Belarusians have been resisting the war in creative and courageous ways. From the outset of Russia's invasion, Belarusian railway workers and IT hackers launched what's been dubbed the Rail War, a guerrilla campaign to sabotage rail lines carrying Russian troops and supplies. At least 52 Belarusian activists, including 30 railroad workers, have been arrested on charges of treason and sabotage for disrupting Russian logistics. In one dramatic instance, Belarusian partisans infiltrated an airbase and blew up a Russian surveillance plane parked near Minsk, a bold act of defiance that infuriated Lukashenko. This undercurrent of resistance is real. If Lukashenko formally enters the war, expect these acts of sabotage to intensify overnight. Bridges, trains, and fuel depots could all become targets for Belarusian partisans trying to hamper the war effort from within. Public anger could also spark mass protests, even if suppressed. Memories of the massive pro-democracy protests in 2020 still linger, and if more soldiers start returning in coffins from Ukraine, it could ignite outrage among the population. Even within the government and military, dissent could grow. Some officials might quietly defect or sabotage orders rather than see their country dragged into an unwinnable war. In essence, by joining Putin's war, Lukashenko risks not only international isolation, but also the collapse of his regime at home. It's important to recognize that Belarus joining the war is largely a symptom of Russia's struggles in Ukraine. Putin didn't secure the quick victory he envisioned. His army has suffered heavy losses and significant setbacks. Over 2 years into the conflict, Russia has lost a substantial portion of its initial force to casualties and equipment losses. Faced with these challenges, Putin is desperate for any advantage, hence the pressure on Belarus to open a northern front. However, this move is born of desperation, not strength. Moreover, involving Belarus could backfire on Russia. While it might provide a temporary tactical edge, a collapse of Belarusian forces or internal chaos in Minsk would force Putin to divert troops to stabilize his allies' regime. This additional burden could further strain Russia's already stretched military and economic resources. Essentially, by dragging Belarus into the war, Putin risks not only amplifying his own challenges, but also isolating himself further on the global stage. The scenario we've painted is undeniably grim. Belarus entering the war in Ukraine would unleash a chain of catastrophic consequences, a broader war front, higher risks of NATO involvement, and even harsher East-West standoff, economic freefall in Belarus, widespread domestic unrest, and a further strained Russian war machine. It's a scenario where everyone loses, except perhaps those who profit from chaos. For the people of Ukraine, it means fighting on yet another front. For Belarusians, it means being dragged into a conflict they overwhelmingly reject. And for the world, it raises the danger of an unpredictable, larger-scale conflict in Eastern Europe. It's crucial for the international community to deter Belarus from entering the war and for all of us to stay informed and engaged. What do you think? Could Belarus become the trigger for an even bigger conflict in Europe? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth geopolitical analysis.